When the defense say that Mr. Zimmerman won't see a courthouse again, that is not true. Zimmerman will have to testify in a civil suit. You cannot avoid that. And his testimony could lead to some very interesting new evidence. The federal government, the Justice Department, suspended an investigation. They did not end it.
That was my colleague, the Reverend Al Sharpton, commenting on the contention of George Zimmerman's defense attorney, Mark O'Mara. Zimmerman would not see another day in court. Joining me now is Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat from New York. Still with me, Michael Eric Dyson, Maya Wiley, and Melissa Harris Perry. Congressman, you did a press event today to talk about what possible investigation might be pursued at the federal level. What avenues of redress are there for people that feel that justice was not done in that courtroom, or even if the verdict was right and proper based on the evidence that jury saw, that the larger sense that something wrong here that should be held to account has gone unaddressed?
Well, Congressman Rangel, Congressman Meeks, myself, several other members of the New York delegation, one wanted to support the continuation of the Justice Department investigation as it relates to the civil rights violations that we believe took place in the killing of Trayvon Martin. But we also wanted to make sure that it was a comprehensive investigation that ultimately led to the presentation of evidence to a grand jury so that the grand jury can decide whether the civil rights of Trayvon Martin were violated. That a Justice Department that ultimately yields no prosecution will only result in a further continuation of the frustration and dismay that we have with the system at this point.
Yeah, Maya.
Well, what's really important here is that we need an evidentiary change of law, because the Justice Department is facing the problem that it has to show generally some form of smoking gun.
Right.
And so George Zimmerman saying effing punk, which we all read as the code about him being black and therefore a criminal, is not generally enough, even though that's the code.
Right. Melissa, I mean, when I think about the politics of this also, I mean, we have seen the president issued a statement that was fairly neutral, I would say. It was kind of thoughtful about the loss of the life of this, but it certainly didn't say take sides or, say this verdict is unjust. It called for peace and reflection. You can only be, seeing what was on Drudge in the run-up to this, seeing the way the right wing has stirred themselves up on this, the fact that Hannity got the first interview with George Zimmerman, you can only imagine, Melissa, what would happen if the President Obama and Eric Holder's Justice Department were to indict George Zimmerman on federal civil rights charges, right?
Yes, but I can also only imagine sort of what would happen if they don't, in terms of their base of support. Amen. So I just want to be really careful that I think that the challenge here is, when the Department of Justice brings these kinds of charges, they typically do it with, as Maya was saying, sort of a smoking gun piece of evidence. And of course, the problem, and Maya and I have been talking about this for days now, is that what racism is not necessarily reflected in our laws. The notion that racism requires you to sort of spout forth these particular kinds of words rather than an understanding that it is a racial context in which people are operating.
Right, and I think in terms of to piggyback on that, in terms of what the politicians do, this is a moment that the president, I think, can seize to assert a bully pulpit authority to suggest that beyond the law, let's have an open, honest engagement with the context that Melissa is speaking about, because we're talking about the implicit assumptions, we're talking about explicit assumptions, we're talking about the jumble of stereotypes that circulate that justify stop and frisk. This is implicated in a whole range of practices that have to be acknowledged and addressed.
And we have had several instances where there have been high-profile state prosecutions that failed in the beating of Rodney King.
Yes.
You had an acquittal, all-white jury, Simi Valley, subsequent federal prosecution.
With videotape.
With videotape, but not necessarily a smoking gun in terms of racial animus.
Right.
Same situation with the choking death of Anthony Baez by police officer Francis Lavoti. Acquittal in the Bronx, subsequent prosecution by Manhattan federal prosecutors that was successful. And in an instance where an African-American stabbed an Orthodox Jewish man, Yankel Rosenbaum, Lemrick Nelson was acquitted by a Brooklyn jury and subsequently prosecuted for a hate crime violation by the Justice Department in the absence of a smoking gun of racial animus. So precedent does exist to move forward by the federal government.
That's a really important point, Maya.
It's a critically important point. Precedent matters. My point, if we telescope out and take a broader frame, at the end of the day, we have got to reform our laws so that we're not constant. Because right now, the attack is on all evidentiary standards in any race case, not just this one. The right is taking on what we call disparate impact, which is whether or not we can look at the impacts of our decision making on a whole group
and in
of people.
The Voting Rights Act, Section 5, as well as Section 4, was essentially, I mean, not on the same legal logic, but on the same essentially structural and historical understanding of some kind of era in which racial bias, because it no longer announces itself facially as racial bias, has now sort of left the playing field.
What we're doing is congratulating racism for having enough sense to hide.
Right.
And so now we're trying to out it to make sure that it's explicitly articulated.
And I also think, and let me just say this and go to you, Melissa, for this response. I also think it's really important to distinguish that between this a judgment that George Zimmerman as a human being is a racist, that word attaches to him as an essential feature of his character. I have no idea. I know that I'm pretty damn sure of is that the race of Trayvon Martin played a huge role in what happened that night because of the suspicion that attached to him as a young black man that was going through George Zimmerman's head, whatever George Zimmerman's in his heart of hearts, because I feel like what ends up happening is the right wants us to litigate a discussion about what is in the heart, what is in the soul, what is the thing we can't see. Talk to the people that know him, and we're not going to. That is not the point, right, Melissa?
And Chris, and this is why communities are reacting with terror and grief and sadness. It's not because we think our child is going to walk down the street and meet up with George Zimmerman. It's not because we think there is some one individual bad actor out there. It is to underline the point that Mike said earlier and that Robin Kelly, the brilliant historian and social critic, wrote about. It is because this is the law working. We can actually see that this jury probably made so-called the right decision based on the evidence presented to them under Florida law. The thing that is terrifying is the very idea that these sets of laws are set up to allow and encourage the circumstances that will lead to the death of African American people, young people, children, and, by the way, let me also make very clear, women, because the other group of people who are deeply impacted by this are folks in circumstances of domestic violence. We know it about Marissa Alexander, which I know you will talk about later, but basically vulnerable populations are made more vulnerable by a set of policies that say this is a system in which you will not be protected even after your death.
Melissa Harris Perry, host of the show Melissa Harris Perry, which airs on Saturday and Sunday mornings at 10 a.m. on MSNBC. Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, MSNBC political analyst Michael Eric Dyson, and Maya Wiley from the Center for Social Inclusion. Thank you all.
Thank you.
If you are young and black in this country, the verdict communicates something very specific. You are suspicious until proven otherwise. I'll talk with a young black man who's experienced that firsthand coming up.